Well, I'm grateful to Tim for taking us through verses 9 to 13, the Wednesday evening Bible study before last. Remember those of you that were there, and Tim had this very helpful diagram to explain how the light came into the world and came to his own, but his own did not receive him. In other words, Jesus the light came to his own people, the Jews, but by and large they rejected him. But to those who did believe in him, he gave the privilege of becoming part of God's family. And so stopping conveniently at verse 13 means that we land this morning, this last Sunday before Christmas, at verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Matthew and Luke, in their Gospels, take us through the narrative of Jesus' birth. John, in his, takes us through the theology of Jesus' birth. And the theology of Jesus' birth is summed up in the first part of verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, Luke records in chapter 2 of his Gospel that while they were in Bethlehem, the time came for the baby Mary, for the baby Mary was expecting to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And according to the theology of John, the Word, God's very own expression of himself, who was both with God and who was God, the Word became flesh. In other words, he put on our humanity, save for our sin. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Bruce Milne, the Bible scholar and commentator, writes this. This statement is one of the most significant and memorable ever penned. Its implications are limitless. It has provided the church over the centuries with a key understanding to the mystery of Jesus Christ. It represents the heart and the climax of John's Gospel. The remaining 20 and a half chapters will be spent unfolding its significance. So unusually this morning, I would like us to dwell on just this one verse and unpack it. Now, there is a carol with a line which sums up quite neatly Jesus, the Word of God, becoming flesh. From the carol, See Amid the Winter Snow, we have these words. Lo, within a manger lies he who built the starry skies. And I've made it our sermon title for this morning. And I'd like to expound this verse under 5 headings, the first being the longest, just to give you the heads up on that. And firstly, in this verse, John tells us that the Word who was God came to this world as God in person. The Word became flesh. God came in person to this world. He didn't send a delegate. He didn't send a representative. He didn't send an emissary. He came in person. He came himself. And by doing so, the invisible became visible, the intangible became tangible, and the spiritual became physical. The infinite Word entered our finite world. He put on the flesh of humanity in all its frailty and vulnerability. Now, the Greek word translated as flesh is the word sarx, and it appears 126 times in the New Testament, and it's mostly used to denote our fallen human nature with all its carnal appetites and desires. But here, in verse 14, it simply means the flesh of manhood. The divine became a person. God's disclosure of himself became flesh and blood. And by doing so, the Word, who was God, bridged the chasm between the God of holiness and a mankind of rebellion. We could not go to him, so he came to us. God came to us in person. Now, there are two things we should understand when John makes this blind, mind-blowing statement. Firstly, we should understand what he means by the word become. And it has a particular meaning here. It doesn't mean that the word became one thing, then ceased to be another, like a caterpillar ceases to be a caterpillar when it becomes a butterfly. It does not mean that the word became human but ceased to be divine. It does not mean that in donning humanity he shed his divine nature. Think of Lot and his wife. When Lot's wife became a pillar of salt in Genesis 39, she ceased to be his wife. However, when Lot became the father of Moab and Ammon, later in Genesis 19, he didn't cease to be Lot. Lot was still Lot. And in the same way, the Word became flesh, but remained the Word. The Word became the perfect man without ceasing to be the perfect God. It's beyond what our minds can grasp. But when the Word became flesh, the perfect combination of deity and humanity took place. Somehow, the Word's deity is kept in perfect tension with his humanity. Graham Kendrick expresses his conundrum well in his hymn. Meekness and majesty, manhood and deity, in perfect harmony, the man who is God. The Word became flesh, and the Word's deity was not compromised by his step into manhood. Secondly, right at the outset of his gospel, John is making the point that the Word was a real human being in order to refute a heresy called Docetism. Docetism means this. This is, Jesus only appeared to be a man. He was really only a spirit. And those proclaiming this false doctrine taught Jesus on earth didn't have a human body. He only appeared to have a human body. He was really a spirit. He was really a phantom. He only had the appearance of humanity. No, writes John emphatically, the Word became flesh, and he had all the attributes of humanity, as he will go on to detail later, such as hunger, thirst, fatigue, sorrow, pain, and death. Now today, the more common error in some sections of the church is that Jesus was just a human being. He may be the supreme example of humanity at its best. He may be the man to look up to and model our lives on. But it doesn't change the reality that Jesus of Nazareth was just a man and nothing more. Do you recognise this man? Some of you older ones might. Come on, Rod. Sorry? Yes, that's right. Lord Donald Soper, Methodist minister. And he famously did a lot of preaching at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. And one wit remarked of him, he loved an argument. He loved an argument. But Donald Soper could not accept the virgin birth or that Jesus was sinless. And by denying these doctrines, he effectively denied Jesus' deity. He denied that the Word became flesh. He denied that God came into the world as a helpless babe. John, by contrast, at the outset of his gospel, is at pains to emphasize quite the opposite. No, God came into the world in person. God in person. Then secondly, God came among us. God came among us and made his dwelling among us. When in July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first men to walk on the moon, they or any of the other astronauts who followed them on the Apollo program were never destined to stay there for very long. The moon was not like the Earth. It was not suited to support human life. Each astronaut needed a spacesuit and a supply of air to walk on the moon. The astronauts had to bring their own supply of food. There was no food for them to eat on the moon. Each journey and landing on the moon was destined to be a temporary affair. It was always meant to be, if you'll excuse the pun, a flying visit. However, when the Word became flesh and came into the world, he made his dwelling among mankind. It was no flying visit. It was no politician's photo opportunity before moving on elsewhere. No, the Word came to reside among his people. He came to live among people. He came to engage with people. He came to interact with people. He came to forge relationships with people. He made his home among us, writes John. And John is using the language of Israel and her wanderings in the wilderness, as Susie read to us after her liberation from Egyptian slavery. And just as the Lord, the God of Israel, was present with Israel in the tent of meeting into which Moses would frequently go to speak to the Lord, so the Word pitched his tent, as it were, among his own people, the Jews, when he came into the world. And as the Word made his dwelling among people, life for him was like life for everyone else. He came into the world not as a fully grown man, independent and strong, but as a newborn baby, dependent and weak. Like everyone, he grew from babyhood into childhood, from childhood into manhood. Luke records chapter 2. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. He grew then not just physically but also spiritually until age 30. Again in Luke's Gospel chapter 3, he was ready at the age of 30 to begin his public ministry. God came then in person, he came among us, and thirdly, he came as God the Son. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son. And it's at this point in the prologue to his gospel that John introduces us to the Son. Hitherto, John has only spoken of the Word. Hereafter, he will only speak of the Son. From this point on, there will be no more reference to the Word, only to the Son. And from the context and sentence structure of verse 14, we see that John identifies the Word as the Son. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory. Whose glory? Well, it has to be the glory of the Word. And then John elaborates on the precise nature of that glory, the glory of the one and only Son. Quite clearly then, John intends his readers to recognize the Word as the Son. And so from now on, it is the Son John refers to when speaking about Jesus, not the Word. And by doing so, John has introduced us to the Trinitarian nature of God and to the second person of the Trinity, God the Son. You see, if the Son is the Word, and the Word was with God in the beginning, and the Word was God, the Son is the Son of God, The God the Son. He's the Son from eternity. He's the Son through whom all things were made. He is the Son without whom nothing was made that has been made. The Word is the Son, God the Son. So you've got God in person, God among us, God the Son, and fourthly, God of glory. We, writes John, have seen his glory. Well, whose glory have John and his fellow disciples seen? Well, it's the glory of the one and only Son. The Greek word translated as glory is the word doxa. It's where we derive our word in English, doxology, from. And doxa, or glory, is another key word of John's Gospel, and it appears some 15 times. As early as chapter 2, John refers to Jesus' glory after the miracle of Cana, where at a wedding, Jesus turns water into wine. Thus, chapter 2, verse 11, revealing his glory to his disciples. But it's chiefly in his death that Jesus will be glorified. And so when Judas leaves the upper room to betray Jesus, Jesus announces to his remaining disciples, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. You know, 1400 years earlier, on Mount Sinai, Moses had experienced a remarkable encounter with God. And Moses has boldly said to the Lord, when alone in his presence, now show me your glory. And the Lord passed in front of Moses, displaying his glory. How did Moses react? Well, he at once bowed to the ground and worshipped. And now, centuries later, John and his fellow disciples have beheld God's glory in the person of his Son. Now, Moses had to be shielded from God's glory. He could only see God's glory from behind. He could only see the back of God and not the face of God, lest he die. But John had seen God's glory he and his fellow disciples could deal with. They had seen his glory in a manner their minds could cope with. They had seen his glory, not the glory of God, not in a consuming fire or in a blinding light, but in a human being. John and his fellow disciples had been able to see the Son's glory in human form, and they'd been able to live to tell the tale. The Son then made the glory of God accessible to people in a way it hadn't been accessible to even Moses. God in person, God among us, God the Son, God of glory. And how then finally was that glory expressed? How was that glory manifested? Well, finally we see God full of grace and truth. The glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Let's return again to Sinai. Moses asked to see God's glory, and the Lord replies that he would cause all his goodness to pass in front of him. And when he does so, the Lord declares himself to be the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love, in faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. But then he adds, he will not leave the guilty unpunished. So he's the Lord full of grace and truth. He's gracious, but he's also just, punishing the unrepentant. How then is the glory of the one and only Son expressed? Well, it's expressed in the miracles he performed. It's expressed in the death he died. It's expressed in the empty tomb and the death he conquered, causing a skeptical Thomas to declare, "My Lord and my God." But it's also expressed in his grace and truth. And he's full as we go on to see, full of grace to the undeserving. Do you remember when the teachers of the law and the Pharisees bring to him a woman caught in adultery? He says to her that he doesn't condemn her, but that she should go and leave her life of sin. But he's also full of truth. He spoke the truth, he lived the truth, he embodied the truth. He declared himself to be the way, the truth, and the life. He said it as it was, and so he says to Nicodemus, the Pharisee who came to him at night, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. So we return to our sermon title. Lo, within a manger lies the one who built the starry skies. John here in this verse 14, he gives us the theological framework for the baby lying in the manger who built the starry skies. The baby is God in person, God among us, God the Son, God of glory, God full of grace and truth. What then are we to do with John's theological explanation of the baby of Bethlehem? How are we to respond? Three things. Firstly, we're to believe it. We're to believe it. John 20 and verse 31. These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus didn't walk around Galilee with some kind of halo above his head with the words on it, Son of God. He did not walk around Jerusalem with a ray of light shining above him saying, Messiah. No, the eyes of faith were necessary to see his divine glory as revealed by the signs he performed. Not everybody saw the glory. Many shut their eyes to it. Many refused to see it. Many were stubborn in their unbelief. So we need to believe it. We need to believe that the Word became flesh. Secondly, we're to contend for it. The Word became flesh is the reason for Christmas. The Word became flesh is the message of Christmas. The Word became flesh is what Christmas is all about. But not according to the world we live in. If it were, our carol service last Sunday evening would have been full to overflowing. We would not have had room for everyone. We would have had to put additional seats in the car park. In fact, none of the churches in Oxford would have had the capacity to accommodate everyone in the village in their carol services. So we're to contend for it in the community. We're to say boldly that Christmas is not about turkey or tinsel or trees, it's about the Word becoming flesh. But we're also to contend for it in the church. Sadly, not everyone in the church believes that the Word became flesh. In 1977, a group of senior churchmen and academics got together and wrote the book, The Myth of God Incarnate. It was heresy, pure and simple. But approaching 50 years later, this view is still widely represented in the church today. The incarnation simply didn't happen. It's a legend, not a historical occurrence. It's a myth. So it's a truth we have to contend for within the church as well as in the community. It's not hair-splitting, it's not pedantic to insist on the doctrine of the incarnation. To neglect it or to deny it is to lead precious souls into error and into spiritual ruin. We're to believe it, we're to contend for it. Lastly, we're to worship. You know, there's a hymn in Mission Praise whose opening verse has these lines and chorus. Who is he in yonder stall at whose feet the shepherds fall. 'Tis the Lord, O wondrous story, 'tis the Lord, the King of glory. At his feet we humbly fall. Crown him, Lord of all. In the words of commentator Bruce Milne, if the Word became flesh, we're called to worship him without cessation, obey him without hesitation, love him without reservation, serve him without qualification, and follow him without renunciation. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Believe it, contend for it, and worship the Word who became flesh. Amen.